clear, Terry.
When viewed at a quarter speed, the shockwave is just visible, but gone in the blink of an eye.
It felt that was like being thumped in the stomach, actually. You felt it through here, sort of really high up. So it must be just compressing the air in your lungs. Or I was down on the ground, you felt it through the ground as well.
It's a phantom of explosive energy, barely detectable. When slowed down nearly 30 times, the shape of the shockwave begins to materialize. And when seen slowed down more than 200 times, its full nature is revealed. An airborne tsunami of destructive power radiating outwards from the epicenter of the explosion. And it's the energy of this shockwave that will propel lethal amounts of debris up and out of the magazine. We have at least 18 different eyewitnesses for this event, and they paint a vivid picture. They talk about a huge cloud of debris, rocks as big as 2 fists, timbers, rafters, clay, and even men blasted far into the sky. One eyewitness says it took at least 30 seconds for what he calls this infernal shower to come crashing back down to Earth.
General Pike says to one of the bystanders that his back's been stoved in along with his ribs. He's probably been hit by falling debris as he lay on the floor. He doesn't die at once, but he dies as he's taken away for treatments. And around him are men with very similar injuries. About 25 American soldiers are killed immediately. About 200 are wounded. The whole area is a scene of devastation, debris and bodies.
200 years after the explosion of the Grand Magazine, evidence is unearthed in the parking lot of Fort York, a copper barrel hoop, which fell to the ground near to the spot where Pike and the American Army were standing.
That's just twisted, isn't it? So that came to rest where on the site?
Right here.
That's incredible. What I've got in my hand is a piece of apparently random twisted copper. I mean, you'd think it was a bit of scrap, you know, from a scrapyard, but it's not. What it is a section, a small piece of one of the barrel bands that held together the gunpowder barrels. And this thing has come from where it started off and fallen through the sky to end up here, which is way outside the fort. And it's exactly the kind of thing that I hoped I might see, but not like this.
When the magazine blows, death rains down in all directions, but not equally so. The American column is up to half a kilometre west of the magazine, but standing just paces from the epicenter of the explosion at the Government House Battery are George Duggan and more than a dozen other York volunteers, all but one of whom will survive the blast comparatively unscathed. What appears to be the asymmetry of the killing zone, the disproportionate number of US casualties, and the directionality of the blast will all lead the Americans to accuse the British of springing a gigantic booby trap. For 200 years, it's an accusation that has been untested and unproven, until now. In an unconfined explosion, the shockwave radiates destructive energy equally in all directions, but this isn't what happened at York. So Andy rigs up a second experiment, this time confining the explosion within a scaled-down model of the Grand Magazine, to see if he can replicate what happened on April the 27th, 1813.
This is experimental archaeology. This is about what we can prove by trying it out. Nobody has done this before. What happens when you blow up a magazine with a doorway like this? Will we find it comes right up, drops down again, or does it go in a direction? And if so, what is that direction going to be?
The experiment is designed by Professor Bibu Mahanti, one of North America's leading experts on the science of explosives. In order to document the explosion and to map the debris field, 4 remotely controlled cameras have been set up around the replica magazine. 2 high-speed cameras are 100 meters in front of the magazine at a 30-degree angle. A third is 50 meters closer at 45 degrees. And a normal speed camera is positioned just 5 meters behind the magazine itself. 10 kilograms of high explosive have been laid. The cameras are set.
Speed, 4-minute warning.
All right, Caroline, give me the siren.
That just was incredible. Let's go have a look and see what we've got.
The moment of the explosion has been documented from 3 different angles. And what each of the cameras captures is evidence of what happened 200 years ago.
I can see timber up on top.
Yep.
So that's been... Wow! Ooh. There's tiny bits of stone here.
Yep.
An almost perfectly symmetrical and circular crater has formed where the magazine once stood, its walls dismantled and thrown outwards. But the direction of the blast has been anything but symmetrical. The camera position just behind the magazine demonstrates how remarkably little debris is thrown backwards, demonstrating how York volunteer George Duggan managed to survive.
We've got a few bits of debris, but actually up there, not in protection, not behind plexiglass, was this. It was in 5 meters of explosion and completely undamaged. Had it been in front, there'd have been nothing left of it.
The side angle demonstrates how most of the debris, up to 90% of it, has been thrown forwards, funneled upwards and outwards in the direction of the doorway, the weakest part of the entire structure.
Come with me.
Yeah,
I'll show
come on,
you.
yeah.
We have a whole line of debris, all aligned along the front entrance of the magazine.
So this matches almost the same width as
Yeah,
the
yeah.
magazine entrance.
It goes a long distance into the lake.
You're kidding. It's always been assumed that the magazine was built facing the lake. If we do that and then we blow it up, what's going to happen is, based on the experiments, is all the material, the most of it, will be ejected towards the American fleet. Now, some of that material does hit the fleet, but also on the American soldiers. For that to happen, you have to turn the magazine through 90 degrees. You can dig it in. The enemy can't shoot into the doorway, which is a really bad idea. More importantly, it's totally camouflaged. They can't see it at all, don't know where it is. Result of that is that when you then blow the magazine, materials ejected based on the experiment about 30 degrees. Some of it drops on the American fleet over there, but the majority drops on the Americans who are waiting to advance.
If Andy's theory is correct, the asymmetry of the killing zone isn't deliberate. It's simply a function of how the magazine was built and the direction in which it faced.
This is an accident, it's not a deliberate war crime.
1 p.m., the 27th of April, 1813. In a field west of muddy York, 38 American soldiers lie dead. 222 injured and maimed. a moment in time when the future of North America hangs in the balance. As the debris settles and the dust clears, the inexorable wheels of history grind into gear and the onward march of war continues. Fort York has been abandoned by the British military, and the road lies open for the main column of the US Army to advance once more. 10-year-old Patrick Feenan is witness to the moment the British capital of Upper Canada falls into enemy hands.
And he gets probably to somewhere around this spot, and he's looking back into the fort. And then he can see the flagpole of the fort. And what he sees is the Union Jack lowered on the flagpole. And he knows, even at the age of 10, what that means. The Americans have the fort.
Victory belongs to the Americans. With the fort in their possession, the American army advances on the town. And as they march into York, the townsfolk must now meet their new rulers.
The reality of the situation was that the town had been abandoned by the British military, and all the citizens were left to their own devices to deal with the Americans. I can actually feel the fear when you think about it. With your military, your defenses gone, and this force coming through.
The King's Writ no longer runs in these streets. British authority has vanished as quickly as the Redcoats. The inhabitants of the town of York, many of whom are American-born citizens, now have a simple choice to make: how best to protect their property. The decision arrived at by the inhabitants of York in April 1813 can still be seen at Canada's National Archive in Ottawa. In negotiating their surrender to the occupying power, the townsfolk agreed to sign a capitulation agreement, according to the terms of which their private property will be protected in return for the militia laying down their arms.
This is the document, the order, the terms of capitulation from the War of 1812.
Thank you.
I'm just going to set it out here for you. Yep. And so you put your gloves on.
What's really interesting about this document is this page is nice, lots of information. But this page here, on the very back, it actually has what's called an explanatory remark on the list of prisoners. Explanatory remark on the list of prisoners. A great number of the officers in the list were not on duty in the garrison of York. Many of them arrived from their places of abode at distances, at various distances, but in time to be included in the capitulation. In other words, men who weren't present at the time of the fighting turn up afterwards, after the surrender, to say, oh yeah, I didn't fight. I wish I had, actually, but I didn't. But while I'm here, could I just sign that I won't promise to do anything else? Not that I did to start with. So I would suggest that somebody putting this in here has actually looked at the terms and conditions and is actually having a bit of a go at the militia by saying, yes, you've all signed this, but you weren't really there present in the battle. You've sort of piggybacked on the whole thing. The fact is that the people here giving their names really would like just to be able to draw a line under it, get on with their lives, and for the war to go away. Just agree, get on with it, it's all over.
But it's far from over. Whether deliberately or otherwise, the American officers delay signing the capitulation. And as the rank and file of their army enters the town, the explosion of the Grand Magazine rankles still.
The soldiers feel that this was treacherous on the part of the British, and therefore they feel fully within their rights to plunder any house that seems not to be occupied. And they proceed to do that.
The prime movers of the looting are the riflemen of Major Forsyth, a man-killing idiot, according to one American officer, whose men are more like outlaws than soldiers. But there's method in Forsyth's madness, and the revenge he wreaks is anything but random. He seeks out the house of Major James Givens, the Indian superintendent who fought against him in the woods. Knowing what his fate will be if he's taken by Forsyth, Givens has fled the town of York. But his wife, Angelique, remains. Her house is entirely stripped of its carpets, curtains, bedsheets, and clothing. Even after her life is threatened at gunpoint, Forsyth's superiors refuse to intervene. In the first year of the war, both sides were guilty of larceny and looting, but nothing on the scale of York. And before they leave the smouldering ruins, in a final symbolic act, the Americans torch the symbols of British power, including the first Parliament buildings and Government House, Upper Canada's equivalent of the White House. Where the ground-penetrating radar had detected anomalies beneath the subsoil, Dr. Ron Williamson's team have now uncovered what they believe to be the remains of a structure, and beside it, an early 19th century garbage dump. As the layers are stripped away, the vestige of a burned post hole is laid bare. And yet more proof of the rape of York. In the burn layer, a shattered brick.
It's handmade. You can sort of see how rough it is.
It's another piece of evidence of that burning event. This is very important.
At the site of the Grand Magazine, the trench now extends from the original lake level up the modern embankment.
Oh. What's that?
And the archaeologists have made an intriguing discovery, one which matches the finds from Government House. Under the ramparts of the modern fort, where there was once a crater, there is now a jumble of buried rubble.
There's a lot of brick here, isn't there? But it's not been laid in mortar, it's just been jumbled, hasn't it?
Fairly rubbly.
Including deposits of burned brick. Similar kinds of bricks from a similar date as the one found in the ruins of Government House.
That's what we're looking for, because there are stories about the crates have been used to dump rubbish in.
What a hole represents is a convenient place to place garbage. So I would expect that we would find, you know, early to mid 19th century garbage used to fill it in, debris, rubble, maybe rubble from the Government House. I would expect to see some signature of a hole filled with garbage.
Burned brick, rubble and debris. What is left of the capital of Upper Canada, dumped in a hole and rediscovered 200 years later. After an orgy of violence, having outstayed their welcome, the Americans sail away, weighted down by the booty of war and the ill will of the townsfolk they'd plundered. No longer a war of liberation, the American invasion of Upper Canada has become a campaign of conquest. And by the summer of 1813, it's a campaign which the Americans think they can win. After the sack of York, the Americans sail across the lake to Niagara, where they capture Fort George. They then drive back the last remaining serious force of redcoats in the colony to Stony Creek. The scene is set for a battle that will decide the fate of Upper Canada. Stony Creek lies just 50 kilometers from York. On the evening of the 5th of June 1813, 3,000 American soldiers now under the command of General Chandler, reached this point along modern-day King Street called Smith's Knoll.
Essentially what we've got is a bank that runs across here. It's about 20 foot high, dropping down towards any potential British advance. He's got a strong defensive position, which he feels confident he can hold out against any British attack if they dare have a go.
The British have retreated 2 kilometers to the west of Chandler's position. As night falls, the US general bivouacs his men in the fields, with his cannon on the higher ground. Outnumbered by 4 to 1, the British know that if they wait till morning, they will lose. So they gamble against all the odds and throw the dice of war.
The British have only one way they can attack, but doing it in such a way that they can get in without firing. If a single American sentry fires a shot, the whole plan's betrayed. So what they've got to do is approach absolutely silently in a very, very, very dark night. It's a desperate measure in a desperate situation. Nothing else will work. Anything regular, conventional, they face defeat.
Undetected, the British approach the American camp. And then
somebody shouts. It's a scream, which other British soldiers take up. For one, it looks as if the whole plan's been betrayed. Many of the British soldiers have been serving out here for years. They've heard Aboriginal war cries. So what they do is they mimic them. It's not a deliberate tactic, we think, but what it does is it terrifies the Americans in this position. They are convinced, and lots and lots of them say this, that every Indian, as they call them, in Canada is coming towards them.
There's this classic image that Americans were all frontiersmen who were hardened by their experiences and were prepared to fight Indians on their own terms. There were some Americans like that. In fact, there were a lot of Americans like that in a place like Kentucky. But the Americans who lived in upstate New York or in New England weren't like that. And a lot of the soldiers who were being thrust into combat, their experience with Indian peoples consists of stories read to them by their mothers about brutal savages, or newspaper reports that they've read about brutal savages. So you take these people with very little military training, you put a uniform on them and a gun in their hands, and you send them into the Canadian woods, and they hear Indians screaming in the background. These people spook.
In their panic, the Americans now open fire. But they're shooting blindly into the pitch-black night as the British advance on them with bayonets fixed.
And one of the things that the British do is they practice an awful lot with the bayonet. They're very, very familiar with getting in with 70 inches of cold steel and using it against their opponents. It's closing in, using the bayonet, going for the soft, squidgy parts of the body. You try and avoid the ribs if you can, because the bayonet will get stuck. If you withdraw it and it's left behind, you're utterly defenseless. So therefore, you're going to get in, stab, put the man down, dispatch him, even using the butt of the weapon to smash his head in and move on, because you don't want survivors standing up behind you and shooting you. You need to make sure that once they're down, they're no threat to you, and you just keep moving forward in the dark.
Over the course of the last 200 years, the bones of those who fought and died here have from time to time been unearthed. Not neatly buried bodies, but pieces of unarticulated remains that have been jumbled by the plowshare and the backhoe. Today, these fragments of traumatized humanity are shedding new light on this, the darkest hour of the war. Pieces of bone recovered by Hamilton City Council from just a few square meters on top of Smith's Knoll are now being subjected to forensic analysis.
We stopped at 1,400 fragments that we could identify and catalogue, and I expect to get to over 2,000 identifiable bone fragments.
Each of which tells a tale of terror in the night.
This is a phalanx from the hand, and that's one of the bones that makes up your fingers. On it, we can see these scratches or lines, and these are possibly what are referred to in forensic cases as defence wounds. With bladed weapons coming at your head or your chest, something, they'll grab it. This is part of a fibula. That's the smaller bone in your lower leg. So this bone sort of sits in here. And if we angle it round slightly, we can see that there is in fact a bladed weapon injury here.
In just one night, up to 300 Americans are killed, injured, or captured, including General Chandler himself. Stony Creek is as close as the Americans will ever come to conquering Canada. There will be more battles fought, more farms plundered, and towns burned. But the following year, the tide of war will shift decisively against the United States. And it's now that the spectre of York will come back to haunt them. By 1814, Britain and her allies have defeated the Emperor Napoleon and brought France to her knees. This allows Britain to send vast numbers of ships and men across the Atlantic. Attacks commence right up and down the US seaboard, eastern Maine, New York, even Chesapeake Bay, striking at the very heart of the Republic. For the Americans, what has begun as a battle on the northern frontier is now a struggle for national survival.
All of a sudden, you've got thousands of veteran British soldiers that can be redeployed. And the British decide, okay, now it's time for some payback. The Americans attacked us when we were at our weakest in 1812. Now they will feel the consequences of that in making a point to the Americans that it is not wise to attack the British Lion.
August 1814. 4,000 British soldiers advance on Washington, D.C. 1 year after the Americans attacked the imperial city of York, it's now the Republic's capital that is in the crosshairs. At the Battle of Bladensburg, within earshot of Washington, D.C., the president himself leads his army in a last-ditch defense of his capital. His wife Dolly makes preparations at the White House to celebrate what she assumes will be a famous American victory. But already, the sounds of battle are echoing on Capitol Hill. And as the British get closer and closer, panic grips the city.
And that's why when people were here in D.C., when they heard the 18-pounder cannons, booming, it echoed all the way to here. So they knew that the British were close.
When the last line of American defense collapses, the road to Washington, D.C. lies open. President Madison, the man who declared war on the British, has already fled the city, a refugee in his own country. His wife and servants he leaves to salvage what they can. According to legend, it's Dolly who saves a precious portrait of George Washington. According to her slave Paul Jennings, her priority is the silverware. As the British march down Pennsylvania Avenue, the last remaining elements of the US Army are left leaderless.
Thinking back 200 years ago, soldiers come up here. They want to find out if anybody's home at the White House. They go up to the front door, they knock, no one's there. You can just imagine the power and the sound of silence in that moment.
Nearly 40 years after the Revolution, the British are back, and the capital of the United States is at their mercy. Just as the Americans had put the torch to Government House, Now the British will do the same to the White House. This is the first and only time in US history that the capital will be occupied by a foreign power. And it would not come under direct attack again until the events of 9/11. Behind the facade, underneath the whitewash, the scars of August 1814 can still be seen. Scorch marks burned into the masonry of the White House. Towards the end of 1814, it's becoming apparent to both sides that neither of them is actually capable of winning this war. And on Christmas Eve, they signed the Peace Treaty of Ghent, bringing hostilities to a formal close. As for the US-Canada border, this is the border before the war, and this is the border after the war. There was no change, no gains and no losses for either side. Over 2 years fighting, and of 20,000 battlefield casualties, the border remained exactly the same. The real victory for the US will come during the following decades, as it resumes its aggressive expansion westwards. And the British Empire, unwilling to risk yet another war, will end up betraying her native allies. And north of the border, there is also a change. But this time in the mindset of the late Loyalist majority population of Upper Canada. A mindset that's been moulded by the events at York.
Before the war, there's not much to identify the people of Canada as Canadians. Now, after the War of 1812, you start to see for the first time English-speaking people in Canada calling themselves Canadians and taking pride in their success at repelling the American invasion.
After the war, and for much of the rest of the century, the dread of American invasion will persist. And 200 years later, this fear has left its mark on the modern landscape. At the site of the Grand Magazine, halfway down the trench, the archaeologists have discovered what happened after the Americans left in 1813, how the fort at York was rebuilt and its ramparts reconstructed.
What we've got is a layer of timber which goes right the way through here, all the way through here, to this vertical timber that seems to be driven through it. And it's actually this mat which sort of holds the structure together.
In the decades that followed the War of 1812, the fort and its defences will be repaired and revamped, ready to repel American aggression. But by the end of the 19th century, the Redcoats will have left. The fort will fall into disuse, and the secret of its ramparts will be forgotten. Until today.
For me, finding this evidence of the 1814 rampart construction with the landscaping above it, it doesn't get any cooler. This is big news. This is something that we're going to want to publish about, absolutely.
What we've got here is definite evidence of the aftermath as the people of York and the British Army remodel their fortress ready for another occasion. Should they come back, they'll be a great deal more ready next time than they were in 1813.
200 years ago, on this site, one of the biggest explosions anyone in North America had ever witnessed gouged a hole in the side of Fort York. After the dust had settled, and the armies of Britain and the United States had moved on to battlefields new, the people of York filled in the hole and repaired the fort. The American-born majority population of Upper Canada were prepared to defend both themselves and what they now called home.
You know, there's that moment in life where the place you were born is no longer your home. The place you've chosen to live as an adult becomes your home. That is my home.
And it was that little muddy York and the events of 1813 that helped to solidify the identity of Canada.